Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm so glad you've joined us. It's going to be a huge hour of power as we learn about the not so humble spud and all of its nutritional benefits. I'd like to start off by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gemma O'Hanlon, Research and Development Manager at Hort Innovation, and I'm also an accredited practicing dietitian. Hort Innovation is bringing you this webinar today thanks to the hardworking potato growers across Australia. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Hort Innovation or Horticulture Innovation Australia in full, we're a non-for-profit research and development corporation, and our aim is to support Aussie growers and drive a prosperous and healthy Australia. We do this by investing in research, marketing and trade programs on behalf of the industries we represent, including fruit, vegetables, nuts, flowers, turf and nursery plants. Now, you may have also come across our new Aussie Potatoes social media pages, and if not, I'd really encourage you to check these out on both Facebook and Instagram. These are all owned and managed behind the scenes by Hort Innovation, and we're super proud of what we do, supporting Aussie growers and promoting the nutritional benefits of locally grown produce. Now, a couple of little things before I introduce our guest speaker for today's webinar. Firstly, no doubt you, like us, are working from home or new locations due to these unprecedented events that we're all currently facing. Now, this is our first ever Zoom webinar, so we're keeping our fingers and toes crossed that it all goes to plan. Now, if for any reason we do have any technical glitches, just know that we will be sharing this webinar with you, the full recording along with the full science repository that we are soon to be launching in May. So no need to madly write notes down as you'll have the recording at your fingertips, but we'd love for you to share any interesting facts you learn along the way, and you can do this by using the hashtag Aussie Potatoes, as well as tagging us on social media using the Aussie Potatoes handle. We'd love to know what you've learnt from today's session, and we'll be sure to reshare it. Now, we'll also be opening up for some questions at the end. So please submit your questions along the way as we go through the webinar, and our administrators will be keeping a close eye on these, and they'll be answered by Jane at the end. Now, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we have time for, but any that we don't have a chance to cover, we'll follow up with you post-event. Now, following the webinar, we'll also be shooting across to you a very quick poll, and we'd love for you to share your feedback on today's webinar so we can give you more of what you want in more sessions to come. Okay, it's now time to introduce the incredible Dr. Jane Watson. So Jane is a highly experienced accredited practicing dietitian with special interests in paediatric and maternal nutrition, PCOS and disordered eating. She receives referrals from a range of local paediatricians and general practitioners, and also has a part-time teaching and research role at the University of Newcastle. So we're in good hands here, guys. So Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Gemma. That's very generous, and thank you everyone for joining us. I guess also a big thanks to Hort Innovation and to potato growers around Australia for making this possible. I'd like to preface the webinar by saying that as humans, and I think as dietitians particularly, we like to have things that fit neatly into boxes. You know, when we talk about evidence-based research, we like to have hard data and numbers that are, you know, really clear and emphatically, you know, inform us one way or the other. I guess I just want to make the note that this area is it's growing so much. The research is quite new. There are compounds in potatoes that we don't even know about yet. There are suggestions that potatoes have qualities that can't be explained just yet. So the research that we're presenting this morning is what's known, but there's still a lot that's not known. So just keep that in mind. There might be still lots of questions that you have at the end, and there are still lots of questions regarding nutrition in general and its contribution to health and disease, as you know, but also for potatoes. If we have a look at a nutrient snapshot of potatoes, the if we put a label on them and we know the power of promotion through marketing the nutritional benefits of food, we could make all of these claims about potatoes. So we know they're low in salt, they have no added sugar, they're a good source of vitamin C, they're a source of vitamin B6, they're a source of fibre. They also fit really well into some of the special diets that we might regularly come across, like gluten-free diets, lactose-free diets, and they're food intolerance friendly, in inverted commas, because they're suitable for low FODMAPs diets. They're also amine and glutamate free, and they're predominantly salicylate free. Some potatoes have low salicylates, but white peeled potatoes are salicylate free. So they're suitable for a really wide range of eating patterns, and I think that's no doubt why potatoes have over the years been such a staple for populations. When we look at the nutritional breakdown of potatoes, and this is based on a medium potato that's steamed, I've used the data from the current FoodWorks 10, which draws from AusNut 2013 as well as the Australian Food Composition database. The part of this project will be to update the nutrient and values, or do some nutrient testing so that we can provide a more comprehensive picture of the nutrients in potatoes, in Australian potatoes, and possibly in some different varieties. But this is just to give us just an overview of the standard medium potato that's steamed. And when you look at the nutrient values, it stacks up really favourably. You can see that for the percent daily intake, potatoes contain more fibre, or 140 gram potato contains more fibre than a slice of multigrain or wholemeal bread. So they're a significant contributor to the fibre intakes of Australians. They contain more potassium than one banana, and we often think of bananas as being really high in potassium, but who would have thought that a medium-sized potato has more potassium than a banana, and reasonable amounts of vitamin C too. So you can see there that 10% of daily intake, which equates to more vitamin C than an apple. When we have a look at potatoes, I think over the years, and particularly more recently with more low carb eating and all sorts of high protein patterns of eating, potatoes have come off not so favourably. But when we look at how potatoes compare to some of the foods that are consumed regularly and considered to be, in some cases, superfoods, although as dietitians, we obviously don't particularly like that term, but you can see the potato stacks up really well. So again, using the values from the previous slide for a medium potato, it equates to, in kilojoule terms, half an avocado or 1.5 cups of raspberries, and it's less calories or kilojoules than a tablespoon of nuts. So although potatoes seem to have this reputation, or there's a general notion that potatoes seem to be quite calorie or kilojoule heavy, when you consider it in terms of other foods that people are eating regularly and considering really healthy, it comes off looking pretty good. It has a higher satiety than almost any food, and there have been some really fabulous studies done with numerous foods, up to 40 foods, and a boiled potato has a higher satiety than almost any other food, including high fat and high protein foods. So they're filling, they're satiating and being lower in kilojoules. You can see that they really have a good place as one of our really healthy carbs. These comparison graphs are not to pitch good healthy carbs against each other, but I think just really to put the potato in perspective of some of the other healthy carbs that we might regularly talk to people about including. So the graph from left to right shows potato on the left, and hopefully everyone can see this clearly, but the next one is pasta, gluten-free pastas after that, then white rice, brown rice, and wholemeal bread. So the aim of this slide really is just to show that per 100 grams, potato contains less kilojoules than any of those other healthy carbs. And sorry, I should just qualify these figures that the comparisons that I've run are based on boiled potatoes. So, of course, hot chips and packets of chips and fried potatoes are an entirely different food. Where we're just looking at potatoes cooked in a healthy way with no additives, and which is a fair comparison, I feel, given that the other carbs that are analysed in these graphs don't have additives either. When we have a look at the carbohydrate content of potato, and again, I think it's the general notion has possibly been that potatoes are really high in carbohydrate, and certainly they're a good carb source, and we need good carbs, but they're not quite as carbohydrate dense as you might think, or as might be commonly perceived. So this graph has the same foods as the previous graph, with potato on the left. So it shows that for 100 grams of potato, which is the blue column, or per cup, which is the green column, that there is less carbohydrate when we compare the same amounts of all of those healthy carbs. So potatoes have less calories or kilojoules and less carbohydrate when compared across the healthy carbs than the other carbohydrate foods. There are some resources that will be available on the website in the bottom left corner, which will be up and running in May. In the meantime, there's been a social media campaign, which is the animation you can see on the left. And there's also been a fact sheet, which some of you may have seen through the Dietitian Connection email. Thank you, Dietitian Connection. And the fact sheet will be available on request, and we can give you an email at the end of the webinar, I think, or it will definitely be on the website. So maybe just make a note of that website because it will be there. And it has hot links. So I'll go through the fact sheet through each of those 4 steps in just a moment. But the other real benefit of the fact sheet is that on the back there are some fabulous up-to-date resources which have hot links so that you can get to drill down into some of the research for anyone that would like to. So the first step on the fact sheet is, I should just say that the aim of the fact sheet was to inform people about maximising the nutrient content of potatoes. So we know that they've got all these fabulous nutrients. We also know that the way that we prepare them and handle them at home and cook them and so on impacts on nutrient content. So the fact sheet is intended just to provide guidance about the best ways of retaining all the good nutrition of potatoes. So keeping the skin on is the first step, and we know that skin contains a lot of fibre. It actually contains 2 or 3 times the dietary fibre of flesh, and flesh does contain some fibre, but the skin is where the majority of fibre is, and it's a combination of soluble and insoluble fibre, which means that you're getting the benefit of both. The other really interesting and emerging area of potato nutrition is phenolics. So phenolic compounds are antioxidants, and I think I've got a slide following this with a little bit more detail, but they're in the skin. So if we're wanting to keep there are antioxidants throughout the potato, but again, there's a high concentration in the skin. So by keeping the skin on, they will be retaining some of those compounds which we know occur in the skin in much higher quantities. And keeping the skin on also reduces nutrient losses during cooking, and we'll touch a little bit more on that, but certainly by leaving the skin on, it helps minimise the losses that we might get through cooking. The second tip on the sheet is to eat coloured potatoes, and there are more and more of these becoming available in Australia. The colours, as you would know, contain nutrients which have antioxidant properties. So by eating a variety of potatoes and including coloured potatoes where you can, it will increase the variety of antioxidants and the quantity of antioxidants. The red and purple potatoes have increased anthocyanins, and the potatoes that are yellow or more orangey colours are the carotenoids, and you can see the difference. There's a list there of the difference between carotenoid quantities in various intensities of yellow colouring of potatoes. So the greater variety of colour, the greater variety of nutrients you get. And the other interesting and more recent finding is that coloured potatoes tend to have a lower GI, and we will cover GI in a little bit more detail, but that's another advantage of eating coloured potatoes. Oh, this is my cheat sheet really. When I was putting this together, I wanted to clarify to myself really phytonutrients seems to be such an enormous thing, and how do they all fit together? And I really like this. There's a link at the bottom and you will get these slides, but they all fit in to, you can see at the top there are 5 different types of phytonutrients. It's that antioxidant group in the teal colour that's branched down to the bottom, and I've just circled the antioxidant nutrients that are in highest amounts in potatoes. So it's the flavonoids, which fall under the polyphenols group, and also carotenoids, or the carotenes in the carotenoids group. That was my cheat sheet for you. The third tip on the fact sheet is to steam or microwave potatoes, and we know that there are nutrient losses when food manufacturers modify potatoes. Sometimes there are nutrient gains, but you know, generally, if we're cooking at home, we want to ensure that we can maintain the nutrients of the potato when they come into our house to when they hit the plate. And one of the best ways of doing that is to steam or microwave potatoes. The things that affect nutrient losses are not just cooking, but just be aware, and we will touch on it a little bit more, the storage, cooking temperature and cooking time. So generally the lower temperature and the shorter cooking time retains more nutrients, which is why the recommendation for steaming or microwaving. Keeping the skin on, which you know, the amount of water, because of course nutrients that are water soluble will tend to leach out from potatoes, and also some of the minerals if there's a lot of water. So steaming and microwaving really helps minimise nutrient losses. But nutrients in potatoes are really diverse, and evaluating the effects of cooking, because different methods of cooking have different effects on different nutrients, it's actually quite tricky. But time and time again, the steaming or microwaving certainly retains more nutrients than frying, stir frying or baking. The fourth tip on the fact sheet is to store and eat your potatoes cold, which I think as dietitians, everyone's well aware of the rationale for that, because of the increase in resistant starch once potatoes have been cooked and cooled. And we know that by cooking method, baking actually retains the most resistant starch, and here's the conundrum of, you know, some cooking methods more positive than others as far as certain nutrients. But microwaved and boiled stack up pretty well too. So that, yeah, by having the benefits of steaming and microwaving, we can still retain resistant starch, and as well as the other nutrients that we want to retain in cooked potatoes. Interestingly as well, and some of you might know this, but cooked potatoes that have been reheated, so cooked potatoes that have been cooled and then are reheated still have higher amounts of resistant starch than potatoes that are cooked and eaten hot. So the highest amount of resistant starch is in cooked potatoes that are cooled and eaten cold in a potato salad, for example. But even if you reheat previously cooked and cooled potatoes, you'll be getting a significant amount of resistant starch. Resistant starch is actually really tricky to quantify, and there's no universally agreed upon method for calculating or analysing resistant starch. So I should just qualify this slide by saying that these are approximate values. They were released in 2012 in a report called the Resistant Starch Report, which this slide just compares the resistant starch in various foods. The current intake, or estimates of current intakes in Australia, are 6 grams a day, which is well below what has been suggested for resistant starch intake for optimal bowel health, which is 20 grams a day. The trouble with the graph that I have here is that the resistant starch report analysed on potatoes that were eaten hot. So when we look at the amount of resistant starch in potatoes that have been cooked and then cooled, it can be as high as 5.4 grams per 100 grams. So you can see why potatoes, when we analyse resistant starch in the cooked and cooled versions, are considered a really valuable, even compared to ripe bananas. They are, you know, significantly higher. Now, glycemic index, I've derived these numbers from the University of Sydney glycemicindex.com register. So I entered potato and collated the values for all potatoes that were boiled or steamed that didn't have any additional ingredients. So no butter added, no olive oil, not served with any foods or processed in any way. So they were just boiled, steamed potatoes. And of the 31 type of potatoes analysed, you can see that the graph here shows that there were 2 of them that had a GI that was considered low, so under 55. It didn't actually specify the varieties for those 2 potatoes. It just, they were listed as boiled whole potatoes. But you can see from this graph that most of the GI values for potatoes on that register currently are between 50 and 80. And I feel that this demonstrates, I mean, the GI values for potatoes are highly variable. In fact, I read something recently that claims that GI values for potatoes are more variable than any other food, and it's still not clear exactly why that is. And I think possibly the understanding of different types of starches in potatoes and the ratios of amylose to amylopectin is probably likely to contribute. But I think potatoes have had a bad rap in the past as far as being a very high GI food, and certainly in some forms they may have higher GI values, but when we look at boiled potatoes, you can see that the glycemic index values tend to be within that medium range and the low higher values, which we're classifying according to low, medium and high categories. So most boiled potatoes, using that data from the Sydney Uni register, fall between 50 and 80 for glycemic index. We know that glycemic index is highly variable and it's affected by all sorts of things, including the variety of potatoes, their preparation method. There's a lower GI for boiled potatoes and a higher GI for roasted baked potatoes. For sweet potatoes, that actually doesn't hold for white potatoes. And again, here's the complexity. Fibre and resistant starch content affects glycemic index, and we know that higher amounts of both reduce GI. And of course, the combination with other foods, if we're pairing potatoes with meat or high protein, high fat foods, that will reduce the glycemic index. The other aspect of variability with regard to glycemic index is the testing method and the foods that the results are indexed against, whether or not it's glucose or white bread. So there's an enormous variability. Interestingly, GI of potatoes is often lower than pasta and white rice. And there are some new cultivars of potatoes, the Charisma, GI-licious and Spudlight, which have shown, certainly the Charisma and GI-licious having lower GI glycemic index than some of the other varieties. Spudlight has less carbohydrate, but the glycemic index hasn't been tested as far as I know. But just remember that the glycemic index is a single measure and it needs interpreting with caution, and I don't need to remind a group of dietitians that, chocolate and potato chips and all sorts of things that have a low GI, we wouldn't recommend as a, contributing in a big way to a healthy intake, because there are lots of other nutrient aspects in terms of nutrient profile that mean that they're not as favourable, and whereas potatoes have got all sorts of other nutritional benefits. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're considering the glycemic index of potatoes. The other big thing I think to consider is the glycemic load. So I know you'll all be familiar with calculating the glycemic index of foods, and I just wanted to run a couple of examples just to show the need for us to be cautious about interpreting glycemic index on its own. So there are higher glycemic index foods that have a lower glycemic load, and we know that load takes into account the portion of the food eaten, which in a sense equates it to or translates it into more meaningful numbers in terms of what we might eat in a meal. So watermelon, of course, is a great example, and you might have seen it before, but it has a GI that's 72, which could be considered slightly higher. but it also has a really low carbohydrate content, which means that the glycemic load is low. So that first calculation of 6.7 is based on 150 grams of watermelon. If we ran the same calculations on white potato for 2, and I've taken sort of a 70 glycemic index of 70 for the first calculation, which is reasonable based on those figures that we looked at before, that gives a glycemic load of 11.7. If we run the same calculation using a glycemic index of 90, the glycemic load is 15. So you can see that, obviously an increased glycemic index results in an increased glycemic load. But just remember, lower GI foods can also have a higher glycemic load. And I think sweet potato, and again, there's no intention to pitch different potatoes against each other, but just keep in mind that sweet potato, which has attained this almost superfood status, there's really not much difference nutritionally, other than the GI seems to be something that comes up quite frequently. But when we have a look at that a little bit more closely, I think the difference is probably less than we might, than is generally kind of accepted. So if you look at the white potato glycemic load, even for that high glycemic index of 90, the difference in glycemic load between sweet potato with a glycemic index of 59, but a much higher carbohydrate intake, is not that much. So 13.4 compared to 15. And just because I thought it was an interesting comparison, the difference, if in terms of the portion size of food, if the white potato portion was 16 grams less, it would have the same glycemic load as the 150 grams of sweet potato. So in terms of the portion size eaten, it's approximately a tablespoon, which in the scheme of things and in the context of a meal or the way we eat food, the tablespoon of potato is probably, it's not a large amount at all. So just keep in mind that differences in glycemic index can seem large, but they might equate to a really small difference in terms of portion size. With regard to storage, the recommendations are to store potatoes in a cool, dark, dry place. By cool, we mean 6 to 10 degrees Celsius. And dry means not in plastic. So although we buy potatoes quite often in plastic bags, it is best to take them out of the plastic bag and put them in a paper bag if possible, or just in a basket or a drawer somewhere where it's nice and dark and dry. The loss of nutrients is much lower if potatoes are stored that way. So there was a study that looked at vitamin C loss during storage and found that over a 4-month period, 90% of vitamin C content was retained when potatoes were stored in this way. So nutrient losses are very low, and potatoes store really well. They're something that in these circumstances where we can't necessarily get to the shops very often, it's something that'll keep well. Other recommendations as far as handling potatoes and preparing them are to rinse or brush off any of the soil, to cool them quickly, and I've included a graph on the right from the Food Standards website, and there's a great leaflet as well regarding food safety practices and cooling and reheating food. Removing foil from potatoes before refrigerating, and ensuring that you eat cooked potatoes that you've refrigerated and cooled quickly, eating cooked potatoes within 3 or 4 days. The ethical considerations, I think that there's more and more consideration given to where our food comes from and the impact on the planet. And I think potatoes, there are all sorts of compelling reasons to include potatoes regularly based on ethical grounds. The first is that they're a whole food. They require little or no processing. Also that potatoes are a local industry. So potatoes are grown all over Australia. They're grown in the Murray region in Victoria and also in Tasmania, South Australia, New South Wales, Queensland and WA, so all over Australia. They're very affordable. Potato prices are increasing more slowly than rice, wheat and corn. And they have a huge contribution to population intake of food, the world's third largest food crop. As far as sustainability, potatoes have high yields. They're a really resilient crop. They grow at elevations in lots of different climate zones, temperate, tropical and subtropical regions. And they have the smallest carbon footprint of all the staples, so they require less land, water and energy than any of the other staple foods. So I think when looking at some of the ethical reasons for eating potatoes, there are lots of good ones. The part of this project, which I mentioned earlier, is to analyse Australian potatoes to provide some more comprehensive nutrient data, which would be accessible through FoodWorks because it would update the Australian Food Composition Database. So we will keep you informed, and it'll be, I imagine the website will be updated with some of that information when it becomes available, but that will include the nutrients, the key nutrients that we looked at in that slide with the nutrient composition of potatoes and also resistant starch. I mentioned before that the website will be launched shortly. It'll be in May, and on that website will be some of the resources that we looked at earlier, the fact sheet, and shortly also a literature review. So a comprehensive review of the literature that's underpinned some of the slides in this webinar. So in summary, I mean, I think the main thing that I've learned in having a closer look at some of this information and research is that potatoes have unfairly not attained the same sort of status as sweet potato, because when you look at the nutrient values of both, they're almost identical other than carotenoids, glycemic index, which we've discussed. But I think potatoes have a place as one of the really healthy carbohydrate foods in our diets and suitable for all sorts of patterns of eating and nutrient needs. The glycemic index is not as high as, and glycemic load not as high as I think is generally perceived when it's put in the context of the type of potato, you know, a boiled potato with the skin on. And also that coloured potatoes have higher levels of antioxidants, so including a variety of potatoes where you can. Also just remembering that the cooking method affects resistant starch more than the type of potato. So the tips on the tip sheet are highly relevant for maximising resistant starch. And also the ethical considerations, and the planet will thank you for choosing potatoes. So that wraps up my slides.
Great, thank you so much, Jane. That was a really wonderful presentation. So I'll get you to stay unmuted so we can have a really good discussion now and answer some questions from our audience. And I guess for me, one of the big takeaways was that we've got to look at potatoes as a whole food. We can't just, think of the GI and some of the higher GI values and then toss it in the bin, because there's so much more to obviously potatoes as a whole food. The fact that they fill us up, they're actually quite low in kilojoules. The fact that there's so many antioxidants, particularly in those pigmented potatoes, and the fact that if we cook them and cool them, that they build that resistant starch, which is something that we're not even getting half of what we really need for really, optimal health. So thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. One great question which has come through from our audience is about this image that potatoes seem to have around not being a good carbohydrate and one that we should be avoiding. Jane, where do you think this has sort of stemmed from, and what can the people that are watching today, what can they do to try to turn that message around?
I think when we look at the research from some of the epidemiological studies, there are studies and the findings are conflicting, as they often are with large-scale population studies looking at nutrition. But the link between some of the, with potato and some health conditions, weight and cardiovascular disease and diabetes, seems to be that the studies haven't looked at or separated healthy ways of preparing potatoes as opposed to potatoes that are fried, hot chips, packets of chips, and that kind of thing. So potato products have been lumped in together. So I think that's really clouded the image or affected the image of potatoes, because of course as dietitians we know that those, the food, a hash brown is not the same as having a boiled potato or a potato salad at home. They're entirely different foods. So I think that's probably clouded some of the scientific aspects, and there was a great systematic review last year and a review a few years ago, and both of them came to the same conclusion, that we need more research looking at whole potatoes as a separate food item to potato products like processed potatoes and hot chips and those sorts of things, which contain high amounts of fat and salt and all sorts of other things, which could implicate, which has meant that good healthy whole food potato has been tarred with the same brush, if you like. It's been considered as the same food, which of course it's not.
Great answer. I love that. I love that you said a hash brown is not the same as a whole, potato that we'd buy and cook at home. I think that's a really great message. And I think, now more than ever, people are in their kitchens cooking more. I think now's a great time for us to be baking our potatoes, making lovely salads and really getting into the kitchen and embracing potatoes rather than going to, the fast food outlet and buying the ultra processed foods that we know are not as good for us, and keeping those for obviously special occasions, not every day. Okay, another question's come through. Are the new low carb potatoes, so probably things like Spud Light, are they worth buying? Are they worth considering?
I have to admit I haven't actually tried them, but I have read some reviews which would suggest that they don't taste any different. Someone cooked them and served them to the family and no one knew any better. So as far as if you like potatoes, then it sounds as though you'll really enjoy Spud Light as well. There's no detectable difference from what I can gather. Again, I think it depends on people's overall diets and their particular nutrition needs. For active individuals, a low-carb potato might not be what they need. They need the carbs in a potato. So, but for someone who's looking and who likes maybe larger portions of potato but feels that they would prefer to cut down on carbohydrate intake, then possibly it's a good option. I think it provides variety in the marketplace, which is a huge benefit given that the individuals have different nutrient or nutritional needs and requirements. So it's another option, but I would think, as with anything nutrition related, there's no blanket recommendation in terms of whole foods other than eat a nice variety and ensure that any changes you make are achieving what you want them to.
Yeah, and I think, you and I would both agree as accredited practicing dietitians that, for if individuals or particular dietary requirements or needs, that we would always recommend that they go and see an accredited practicing dietitian and that they get that individualised advice based on their medical conditions and their particular needs. But I think that's a great message. I've actually tried Spud Light myself, and I think because it has that higher water content, it does have a different texture in the final result, which some people may prefer, some may not. So I think, at the end of the day, though, I think, potatoes of all shapes and sizes, colours and types, they're something we all need to put more on our plate and to be cooking at home with. I think that's really the key message here. Now we've got another question. Do roasted or baked and cooled potatoes have improved resistant starch as well?
Sorry, what was that? Do roasted and baked and then cooled potatoes have higher amounts of resistant starch. Yes,
So do
absolutely.
they still build the resistant starch just like a boiled potato would once it's cool?
Yeah, they do. And there is some evidence that baked and roasted potatoes actually have higher amounts of resistant starch. And I think that's probably because they're generally under, the cooking times are longer and the temperatures are higher, which helps promote resistant starch. So yes, they do have higher amounts of resistant starch if they're baked or roasted. I can't remember, so I'm trying to think of the figures. It's not a whole lot different, and I can't remember the figures off the top of my head. I can chase that up, but yeah, they do have more resistant starch.
Yeah,
so any potato that's cooked and cooled has a much higher level of resistant starch than potato that's eaten hot, but slightly higher in the baked and roasted.
Excellent. And Jane, a more personal question: how do you like to cook your potatoes at home?
You sprung that on me, Gemma. I'm actually we cook potatoes a lot. I've got 3 very active sons, and keeping up the food. And here's the advantage of having a food that's satiating, that's high in carbohydrate. That potatoes are great value in our house. And my boys have actually even taken, because they're slightly lazy about cooking, and I like encouraging them to cook. They cook them in the skins and then mash them, which we've all come to quite enjoy. But yeah, potatoes are really popular in our house.
Excellent. Great fuel for hungry boys, aren't they? Now, I've just had a comment from Sue Rad, a dietitian colleague of mine, and she's obviously done a lot of research in the Mediterranean diet. So she said, thank you for an excellent presentation. When I was doing research on the Mediterranean diet, I discovered most diet index tools excluded the measure of potatoes, probably because in Western countries they're consumed as hot chips, etc. Yet potato was included regularly as part of the vegetable intake in the Mediterranean, and people benefited from the reasons you have outlined. Potatoes were never restricted. So there you go. I think
thank you, Sue.
Just reinforces that message, doesn't it, about whole foods and the importance of also those, eating foods whole and unprocessed foods, and how good they are for us. Now, Jane, another question for you. Sorry, I'm picking your brain, but want to maximise this opportunity to learn from all your knowledge. We know that sweet potatoes seem to have this, superfood status, and it's very on trend, and sweet potato toast and all the rest. What would your advice be to the average person out there who's picking up a sweet potato, picking up a potato and going, which one, what's better?
I feel that they're both, the only differences nutritionally between them are that sweet potato has slightly more carotenoids, although some of those new coloured varieties probably contain almost equivalent amounts. But carotenoids are something that we can get in other foods anyway. So if we eat carrots from time to time, that would easily meet our carotenoid requirement. So in that sense, I would treat sweet potato and any other variety of potato in exactly the same way. So enjoy them both. I certainly wouldn't recommend one over the other. I would be a little bit careful, I guess, about eating large amounts of roasted sweet potato, given the glycemic index increases so markedly. So just keeping that in mind for people who are managing diabetes, for example, but something that they may not have realised, that the glycemic load can be a little bit higher. But no, I would, given that their nutrient profiles are almost identical otherwise, I would just enjoy a variety of them. I wouldn't pitch one higher than the other, which is why that superfood status of sweet potatoes, I feel, even though I love that a whole food has superfood status, I feel that white and all other coloured potatoes should have the same status. So I think, I would treat them equally. I don't think there's a way of splitting them. In the context of a healthy, varied diet, I wouldn't consider one better than the other.
Excellent. So they both deserve a spot on our plate. I'm very happy to hear that. Now, we've also had a question with the GI testing that we mentioned in terms of the 50 to 80 roughly for the GI of fresh potatoes. Is that fresh potatoes or cooled potatoes?
Oh, good point. On the bottom of that slide, it's cooked potatoes. So they were boiled or steamed, and they were eaten or tested hot. So actually I hadn't even thought about that. If they were cooled, then the GIs would be expected to be lower because with an increase in resistant starch, glycemic index is lower. So those were based on potatoes that were tested hot, and they were either boiled or steamed with no other additives.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So it could potentially, once they're cooled down, it could have a lower GI, and also the benefits of the resistant starch building potentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think we are now out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. I want to say a huge thank you to Jane for coming along today and sharing all your wisdom and knowledge with us. And I've certainly taken a lot out of this, and I think tonight I'm going to go and do some baked potatoes. Why not? And especially coming into winter, right? It's that time where we all want those delicious filling comfort foods that are also good for us. So I'm certainly going to go and do that tonight. Now, just a couple of reminders before we close up. We will be sharing the recording with you, as well as the brand new Aussie Potatoes website, which is going live in May, so stay tuned for that. We'll also be sharing a very quick poll after this webinar, so we'd love your feedback, good, bad and ugly. We want to hear it all. We want to do our best to help to assist with your needs and your knowledge, and how we can share the potato love with you. The other thing to share is there's lots of other things that we have in the pipeline to come. So all I can say is watch this space and stay tuned. But thank you again for joining us. I hope you found this useful. Please share your learnings on your social media feeds, hashtagging Aussie Potatoes and tagging us at Aussie Potatoes on Facebook and Instagram. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.